Hello, welcome to the Incas channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and activate the notification bell to stay updated on the most mysterious stories in the world. In terms of the mythological foundations of the Inca Empire, the two key figures are Manco Capac and Mama Oclo, who, according to legend, came from Lake Titicaca. Manco Capac is a legendary Inca who emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca, carrying a golden staff. According to the legend, the place where this staff embedded itself in the ground would be the ideal location to establish his empire. The legend says that he set out with his sister, Mama Oclo, and part of his people towards the land that would later become Cusco. After months, or perhaps years, as we do not have an exact chronology, they arrived in Cusco, where the golden staff embedded itself in the ground. There, Manco Capac founded the city of Cusco. It is important to mention that the Incas had true political genius, as at the height of the Inca Empire, their territory stretched from southern Colombia to central Chile, an enormous area, even by today's standards. They managed to maintain this territory without the use of a written language as we know it, without horses for transportation, and without any type of cart, as they had not yet discovered the wheel. Everything was organized by a network of infantry soldiers, and we can imagine the distances that had to be covered. Conquests were not always achieved through combat and war. In fact, fighting was avoided whenever possible. There was a good reason for this. For the Incas, what mattered was not just acquiring territory but also expanding their workforce. This workforce consisted of the resident population, who voluntarily submitted and integrated into the ranks of the empire. The Incas used a very clever diplomatic strategy. They constantly offered their neighbors opportunities to join the empire, either by proposing marriages between princes or local chiefs and noble women from the Inca Empire, or by offering them desirable gifts such as fabrics, grains, potatoes, and of course, cacao. Additionally, they offered a high level of security because, once a people became part of the Inca hegemony, they were protected by the Incas. Stone architecture already existed during the Wari period, which preceded the Inca period, in the form of large stone buildings. The Incas, in turn, developed their own techniques, creating bossage walls where the stones were selected to fit perfectly together, so much so that there was no space for a razor blade to slide between them. The only element that contrasted with the beauty of the walls was the thatched roof, as the Incas had not yet developed techniques to construct arches and complete the roof. The stones used were quarried and transported to the construction site by dragging or rolling them on wooden beams. They were then placed on earthen platforms, arranged on a slight incline, and dragged or rolled into place. This process required a tremendous amount of labor, but it was entirely feasible. The terraces built by the Incas were occasionally used for agricultural purposes, but more often for the cultivation of ceremonial maize, which was used to make chicha, the ceremonial beer distributed during festive occasions as a symbol of Incan power. In these mountainous and rainy areas, where the slopes are very steep, the land needed to be leveled into terraces. Otherwise, the fertile soil would be washed down into the valley by rainwater. This terrace farming system allowed the Incas to make effective use of the land. Regarding Machu Picchu, for many years, it was believed to be a mountain fortress designed to protect access to the Urubamba Valley from rebellious tribes living in the Amazon basin. The idea was to prevent enemies from gaining access to the city of Cusco. However, we now know that this was not the case, as the Incas already controlled these populations. Another inconsistency in the theory of Machu Picchu as a fortress is the absence of military garrisons to protect it, which would be expected in a citadel. When analyzing the size of Machu Picchu and estimating the number of people who could have lived there, it is believed that the population did not exceed 300 to 500 people, far from the estimate of 3,000 to 4,000 people made years ago. Over time, many conceptions about Machu Picchu have changed. We now understand that high-altitude locations were considered sacred and played an important role in mountain worship rituals and, specifically, in earth cults. Machu Picchu's function was similar to that of a modern palace, like a summer palace. Who lived in Machu Picchu? Obviously, the Inca resided there when he came from time to time for special occasions and to preside over ceremonies. There were also priests who took care of organizing these ceremonies. In addition, there were servants, known as llanas, who worked in the service of the Incas. The population was small, which explains the type of architecture found at the site. Although it was rustic and local, the architecture still adhered to the aesthetic and architectural standards of the ruling elite, indicating their presence. The Incas did not settle just anywhere. They lived only in places where they could be in contact with their deities and in communication with their ancestors. They believed their ancestors lived atop the mountains. In the case of the Vilcabamba Range, Machu Picchu is surrounded by enormous peaks, snow-covered mountains, and glaciers, where the ancestors were believed to reside and which also represented the projected image of certain constellations. These constellations and mountains were seen as protectors. All the buildings in Machu Picchu were oriented towards specific peaks and mountains, representing the central square of Cusco and the starting point of the four main roads. One of the important sites was Arcapida, where the Incas would gather on special occasions to worship the Inca or listen to him speak. Another monument of particular significance was Intihuatana, a miniature replica of the Huayna Picchu mountain located across the way. This structure was an exact copy of the peak and was positioned on a platform, possibly being used as a sundial during certain ceremonies. Another sacred place was the Temple of the Sun, the only circular building in the city. This tower may have been used to study the stars. Below it, there is a natural cave that likely served as a royal tomb. It contains an altar shaped like a staircase and several beautifully carved sacred niches. The Incas were undoubtedly the world's greatest experts in stone architecture. In ritual terms, the emperor himself was considered the representative of the sun, Inti. He presented himself as such, and at the same time, all gold objects, believed to come directly from the sun, were also seen as coming from the Inca himself. He was linked to his sister wife, who emanated from the moon. In each province, there was an Inca governor who ruled over all four regions, the four suyus. In each suyu, or in each major city, there was also an official representative. This official delegate of the Inca, in turn, commanded a number of local lords whose lands were subdivided into administrative districts. It was a sort of grid system in which everyone had their place. Paying tribute was mandatory, with no exceptions. Every year, an inspector would visit each province to collect the tribute. It worked somewhat like our tax inspectors. They used long knotted cords, known as quipus. Each knotted cord was organized in a decimal system, similar to the Chinese abacus. The system operated on much the same principle. They had developed a combination of knots, twisted fibers, and colors from which they could decipher a wide range of numerical information. It was based on a system of units, tens, hundreds, thousands, etc., and was used to record information about the population distribution within a territory or part of a territory. Other information, such as the amount of goods stored in state warehouses known as kalkas, as well as a series of other numerical records, was also kept using these knotted cords. Most of the tribute was paid in manual labor. Although it could be in goods, such as sacks of cocoa, it was mainly in labor. Several tributaries were sent to Cusco to participate in large construction projects, join the army, build roads, and generally contribute to the maintenance of the state. In terms of administration, the Inca organization was flawless. We know that the Incas had a number of private residences, their palaces, or royal estates. One example is the Pisac site in the Sacred Valley, which was both a palace and a ceremonial center. Divided into several areas, Pisac includes a citadel in the northern section and a sacred part with the Temple of the Sun. It is here that the Intihuatana, a stone mounted with its central line oriented towards the sun, is found. Surrounding it are meeting points known as quillancas, large buildings where crowds gathered when the Incas visited or when the governor organized official festivities. A notable feature of Pisac is its many terraces, most of which are ceremonial and often connected to maize production. Maize was reserved for making chicha, a beverage used in important celebrations. Chicha libations were offered by the Inca as a testament to their power. Despite the numerous terraces, they were not used for cultivating food such as potatoes, nor did they contribute to feeding the population. Cultivated land was, in principle, divided into three types. One part for the Inca or his representatives, such as the political elite. Another part designated for religious cults, and the third part left for the community. The Inca territory consisted of a whole series of microclimates, ranging from altitudes of 5,000 meters to warm tropical climates. They defined three large geographical regions with different production methods, territories, and ecozones. Since ancient times, long before the Incas, resident populations made use of these ecozones. With the colonial system and the sending of colonists to different regions, the Incas managed to access a wide range of products, most of which were provided by local leaders as tribute. In the Altiplano, they grew many types of potatoes, about 440 different varieties. Potatoes were useful because they could provide nutrition for a larger number of people. Of course, there was also maize, which grew in the warmer valleys, such as Cooke and Paisac, in sheltered valleys. Corn was very important because it was the basic ingredient for the famous corn beer, which was used for libations to the sun and the Incas. Cocoa was also significant, though not classified as a food. Cocoa, which grew in the warmer regions, was highly sought after for its use in divination and medicine. It was used to treat a variety of ailments and fatigue. 2 kilometers from Cusco are the ruins of a massive military camp, the largest in the area, which could house up to 5,000 warriors. Sacsayhuaman, meaning satisfied falcon in Quechua, was constructed by the 9th Inca, Pachacutec. He envisioned Cusco in the shape of a puma and built Sacsayhuaman as the head of the animal, with its 22 zigzagging walls representing the puma's teeth. The techniques they used to transport and construct such enormous structures remain a mystery, especially considering they had not yet discovered the wheel. 3 towers once stood above the walls, but today only their foundations remain. One of the last battles of the Spanish conquest took place here, notably remembered for the heroic story of Inca Kahawit. When the Spanish attacked the tower where he had retreated with his men, he leaped from the tower to his death rather than surrender. There were many languages within the Inca Empire, with the most important being the various forms of Quechua. One of the strengths of the Inca regime was the creation of a general language, known as lingua general, used for communication between distant communities. This general language was preserved because missionaries learned it and passed it on, becoming the common language for a large part of South America. Moray, a circular terraced area, is believed to have been used as an agronomic observatory. There were different crops associated with various ecozones because the land covered multiple ecological zones. The terraces of Moray, cut into this deep amphitheater, are an impressive archaeological site. This location consists of concentric terraces that rise at different levels, all carved into a massive clay basin. Each level seems to have a unique microclimate, with layers descending to a depth of 150 meters. The different levels are accessible through an ingenious system of steps integrated into the walls, and irrigation channels direct water from one level to another via ravines carved into the stone. The temperature and humidity differences between each layer allowed the Incas to test plant growth according to climate and altitude. Regarding communication, the Incas inherited an extensive communication network that existed before their arrival and further developed it. They maintained and expanded the roads built by the Wallace, which were compared to Roman roads. The Spanish, who used them, noted that they were of considerably higher quality. The Incas had a highly advanced information system for their time, known as chasquis, the messenger system. These roads were used by runners who covered relatively short distances and took turns. In just one day, alternating shifts, they could relay information between people living on the coast. Unlike other cultures of the time, the Incas had not yet discovered the wheel and did not use animal labor. The only native pack animal of the Andes is the llama. All transport, both of goods and people, was carried out using llama caravans. The Spanish described caravans of 3,000 and even 3,500 to 4,000 animals, meaning one could watch a procession of llamas for 1.5 to 2 hours. These llamas belonged to different communities that provided their animals to the Incas for transporting all kinds of goods. It's important to remember that Europeans arriving by ship in Panama traveled for up to a year before reaching Peru. This was a time in history when travel was much slower, allowing people, in a way, to do things at their own pace. In Maras, we find an impressive number of salt ponds. These are communal terraces currently managed by a local cooperative. The salt comes from a small source of saline water. The site has been used since pre-Inca times, apparently dating back to the so-called early intermediate period. They discovered that by pouring saline water over the terraces and letting it evaporate all day under the hot sun, a layer of salt would remain on the ground. The Incas utilized this system to harvest salt. Salt was crucial both for rituals and daily life. For instance, during certain festivals, people would abstain from salt, while in others, it was used to ward off evil spirits. Salt was also used for cleaning. As a fundamental staple, the community cultivated salt. Cusco is located in a very prosperous region, near the famous Sacred Valley, specifically the Yuki Valley, which is an extremely beautiful area. Gradually, Cusco was established as the capital of the Inca Empire. It was here that the four main roads began, branching out to form the four principal territories that together constituted Tawantinsuyu, or the Empire of Four Parts, North, South, East, and West, who lived in Cusco. Essentially, Cusco was inhabited by the chieftains and members of the ruling elite. Each conquered population would have representatives living in or near the city of Cusco. It was a form of power centralization. Cusco, meaning navel of the world, illustrates how the city was seen as the heart of the empire. Another element reinforcing this sense of centrality was the Temple of the Sun, known as Coricancha. Cori means gold in Quechua, and the sun was considered the ancestor of the Incas, or at least that was their claim. In the Temple of the Sun, the Inca mummies, the ancestors of the Incas, were kept. There were also other astrological symbols, as well as a number of objects typically found in gardens, such as golden replicas of animals and plants. Today, only the basic outlines of what was once the most luxurious temple of the Inca Empire remain. At the time, the walls of Coricancha were covered with 700 gold sheets, each weighing almost 2 kilograms. We can still admire a solid gold stellar plaque depicting Mother Earth and the Incas. Only 4 rooms of the ancient temple still exist. The walls, built at a slight angle, are made with perfectly fitted stone blocks. The trapezoidal doors and niches are typical of Pacacutec's Inca architecture. It is believed that the 2 larger rooms were dedicated to temples of the Moon, Venus, and the Pleiades, with their walls covered in silver. The 2 smaller rooms were likely dedicated to the worship of rainbows and lightning. Before entering the temple, people would fast and come barefoot, carrying a weight on their backs as a sign of humility. The most important ceremonies of the Inca sovereigns, including weddings, coronations, and funerals, took place in the Temple of the Sun. It was also where the mummies were preserved. The golden thrones and everything around were covered with the precious yellow metal, a symbol of the sun. Even the famous inner gardens contained golden cobs of corn and fruits. We know that the site in Ollantaytambo was an Inca palace and ceremonial center because, above the Inca temple, there is a Temple of the Sun. Obviously, it was never fully completed. The stones here are unique to this site and feature elements that almost resemble porphyry. In fact, it is not porphyry but a perfectly polished rock, which must have been difficult to transport here. There is a whole system of terraces and fortresses around the city for protection, but the entire central area is ceremonial, and the lower parts are as well, because the irrigation network found here suggests that these are ritual terraces used to cultivate corn for libations rather than for agricultural purposes. At the lowest part, we find the Cajanca, one of the large constructions with many open doors, which were used by the Inca and his armies for important meetings or festive gatherings. In the Andes, textiles were like a language unto themselves. Unlike the Mesoamerican cultures of Central America, where we find dated texts, there was no writing in the Andes. The equivalent of writing was textiles, a completely different type of language. The way the threads were arranged, the warp threads in relation to the weft in a fabric, could represent special configurations. This means that when the weft is laid out on the ground, the weaver conceives the pattern in 3 dimensions, as one would today. Records show that during Pacacutec's reign, the Incas gave a textile to one of the ambassadors from the Calasuyu region. The textile was shaped like a map showing part of the territory. This is important because, in a way, these are the precursors to the road maps we use to navigate today. Tambomaque, as the name suggests, is a relay post. The road from Cusco to the Sacred Valley is dotted with different sites. Some were temporary residences, while others were tambos, buildings used by the armies. They served both as meeting places and as resting spots for the military. This was the case at Tambomaque. Not far from Tambomaque, there was a ceremonial temple and a natural water source. The name is often translated as the House of the Virgins. The site is the center of a large irrigation network, featuring a sacred spring as well as a series of monuments reserved exclusively for women. In general, an Inca visiting the site would not have been allowed to enter, as it was a sort of monastery reserved solely for women. Inca gold is something we often hear about, but there is very little evidence of it, as almost all Inca gold was seized by the Spanish, and most of the objects in gold were simply melted down, whether they were artworks, tableware, or ornaments. The Spanish melted down the gold because, for them, it had no aesthetic value or symbolic power. Therefore, they had no reason to respect the objects. They simply wanted to obtain gold bars and pieces of gold. Interestingly, most of the goldsmiths working for the Incas were not actually Incas. They came from northern Peru, from the famous Chimu kingdom. The Incas brought Chimu goldsmiths to Cusco so that their skills could serve the Inca Empire instead of the Chimu kings. It is a fortified stronghold, a military checkpoint. The remaining traces are sufficient to give us an idea of where the forts were located and how they controlled access to the sacred valley on the other side in Pisac. Among the relics found in the excavations of the small red fortress, so named because of the pink color of its stones, were several fragments of red ceramics. Opinions about these relics vary. We can only imagine. The mummies were treated differently from Egyptian mummies, which were embalmed and placed inside a sarcophagus. Here, they were dried and then covered with the most valuable pieces of cloth. The mummies were equipped with their belongings, servants, and women, forming a complete courtly retinue. They were revered and carried in processions. An official from each clan would bring the mummy, which was transported with full pomp and pride inside and around the plaza of Cusco to be worshipped. We are essentially talking about the descendants of the Incas and members of the elite. As common people were not allowed to access this sacred area, they would provide food to the mummies, which were placed on a sort of throne and offered maize beer and other delicacies. To some extent, the mummies were viewed as alive. Once the Inca mummies were filled with all the energy they could receive in the form of offerings, they were returned to their residences, where they were preserved indefinitely. Like other Andean societies, the Incas also practiced human sacrifice. The Machicas and Chimbu, for example, sacrificed humans. It was previously believed that the Incas did not do this, likely due to Garcilaso de la Vega's attempt to portray them as a very cultured and rational people. Nevertheless, sacrifices did occur and are mentioned in 16th century sources. Unlike the ancient Mexican peoples, such as the Maya and Aztecs, the Incas primarily sacrificed children or young people, and only on specific occasions, such as the birth of an heir or weddings. Each community was asked to provide the most beautiful child, with victims generally being the most attractive. These children were treated with great respect and sacrificed in the mountains. It was in the 20th century, using new archaeological research methods, that these sacrifices were discovered. The remains of children were found on mountain peaks and glaciers, matching the 16th century records we had. In Chinchero, the market square is surrounded by a massive Inca wall adorned with 10 trapezoidal niches. With its ancient temple and palace, the city of Chinchero guarded the entrance to the sacred valley. Here, we get a clear sense of the sacred nature of Inca constructions and even the terraces, some of which are still cultivated today. Chinchero is another palace, which also served as a temporary residence with a series of ceremonial terraces spreading out behind it at different levels. On 2 of these levels, we find miniature models of the mountains visible on the horizon, which are characteristic elements of Inca rituals. These miniatures appeared to be small reproductions. The Incas considered the mountains sacred and made libations on these models, as they could not access the actual mountains. At the time of the Spanish arrival, a civil war was underway between 2 Inca brothers. The north was under the control of Atahualpa, while the south, including the city of Cusco, was governed by Huascar. Although they were half-brothers, both aimed to kill each other. By the time the Spanish arrived, Atahualpa had achieved a great victory and had ordered the execution of his brother, as well as the extermination of all the families of Huascar's allies in Cusco, a group of several hundred people. For instance, we know that the mummies of Pacacutec and Tupac Yupanqui were burned at that time, despite being the founders of the Inca Empire. Only Atahualpa remained, and he was the Inca of the north and, crucially, of the city of Cusco, which he helped to found. He controlled a vast territory with many rebellious areas that the Incas struggled to subdue. It reached a point where it became impossible. In an empire stretching over 3,000 kilometers from north to south, it was impractical to send an army to a location 2,000 kilometers away, given that the only transportation available was on foot, which would take several months. If a second rebellion broke out in the south, another army would be needed, but there were not enough men. Pizarro and his men arrived at that moment and marched to Cajamarca. The situation turned in favor of the conquest, as well as the fact that many of those subjected to Inca rule seized the opportunity for change. Although much has been said in favor of the Incas, they were, in reality, an important and military people. For those who had been subjugated, the arrival of the Spanish represented an irresistible opportunity to finally get rid of Atahualpa. When the Spanish arrived, they quickly realized that an empire with a pyramid-shaped political structure and a single sovereign leader could not survive once that leadership figure was removed. That was exactly what Pizarro did. It took him several years to complete his explorations. In 1532, he landed on the Peruvian coast in northern Peru. He quickly set off on the Sierra route to Cajamarca, where he encountered the Inca and his troops. When Atahualpa was captured, he knew the Spaniards wanted gold. Therefore, he offered to buy his freedom by filling the room where he was held with gold. He proposed a ransom payment, a system common in Europe at the time. Atahualpa made the offer, but Pizarro was well aware that if he let Atahualpa go, the Inca would regain all his former power, putting the Spaniards in a very precarious position. He knew they would struggle to capture the Inca a second time. Pizarro sentenced him to trial, accusing the Inca of misusing the Bible by throwing it on the ground and of murdering his half-brother, Huáscar. Atahualpa was charged with murder and sentenced to death. He was executed for actions that, while perfectly normal within his own culture, were, of course, quickly condemned by Spanish law. From that moment on, the Spaniards used the Incas as puppet rulers. They were the legitimate successors to the emperor they had removed from power and executed, manipulated by the Spaniards to facilitate their conquest of the empire. Audio spoken in French, it worked very well. Pizarro had several brothers. The only legitimate one was Hernando, who went to Pacacamac. Then there was a bastard named Gonzalo, who opposed the Spanish throne. Another was known as Pizarro del Bueno. According to records, he was killed in Plaza de Armas. Lastly, there was Martin de Alcántara, who was Francisco's half-brother on his mother's side. Following them were his cousins, connected through a complex network of relationships. Diego de Almagro, who also figures in the conquest of Peru, was an unusual character. He was quite independent. Initially, he was connected to the Pizarro clan, but later he sought to distance himself from his allies. To understand Pizarro and Almagro, and the terrible reputations of the conquistadors whose behavior is widely disapproved of today, we must consider the context of the time. In Europe back then, looting and pillaging were widespread. These men took more because there was much more to be gained. They were no worse than many others. In the late Middle Ages, there was a form of patronage where it was expected that a leader would sustain his army. The more he plundered, the richer he became, and the larger his army grew, increasing the demands on his generosity. Their approach was very different from ours. Several civil wars broke out among them for various reasons: ambition, plunder, and precedence. The crown intervened to put an end to it all. First, they sent a viceroy who was executed. Then other officials arrived and managed to stop the bloodshed, punishing the conquistadors. Things ended very badly for them. But, although it seems strange, it was these conquistadors who, in this brutal military context, were among the first to mix races, having many mixed-race children. It is impossible to change history, but if Pizarro had arrived many years earlier under Huayna Capac, things might have been very different because the empire was more stable at that time. Or perhaps, just as with the Romans, the Inca civilization would have collapsed, and other smaller civilizations would have emerged. This would have been typical of the pattern that emerged throughout the history of the Andes. To complement, it is important to highlight that Pizarro's arrival, along with his men, occurred during a time of great instability in the Inca Empire, which facilitated the conquest. The civil war between the brothers Atahualpa and Huáscar weakened the empire, making it more vulnerable to the tactics of the Spanish conquistadors. Moreover, diseases brought by the Europeans, such as smallpox, had already begun to decimate the indigenous population, further weakening resistance. Pizarro's strategy of capturing Atahualpa and then using his image as a puppet to maintain control over the empire was both shrewd and ruthless. After Atahualpa's execution, the Spaniards continued to face resistance but managed to subdue the different Inca factions, often exploiting internal divisions. The impact of the Spanish conquest was devastating for Inca society. The destruction of political, social, and cultural structures led to the disintegration of the empire, and the ensuing colonization imposed a new order based on exploitation and the imposition of European culture. The encomienda system, for instance, exploited the indigenous people, forcing them to work for the colonizers in exchange for protection and Christian education, which in practice resulted in abuse and forced labor. On the other hand, the cultural fusion that occurred over the centuries left a profound legacy in Peru and other Andean regions. The blending of European and indigenous cultures resulted in a rich cultural tapestry that is evident in the language, art, cuisine, and popular traditions. Today, Peru is an example of how different cultural heritages can coexist despite a history of violence and colonization. Had Pizarro arrived at a time when the empire was stronger and more unified, it is possible that Inca resistance would have been more effective, potentially altering the course of history. However, as with many other civilizations throughout history, the Inca Empire was at a point of vulnerability that the Spaniards were able to exploit with brutal efficiency. History, therefore, is not just a record of events, but also a reflection of the circumstances and choices that shaped the destiny of entire peoples. We can delve even further into the discussion about the conquest of the Inca Empire and its consequences by addressing additional aspects that shaped the history of the Andean region. Demographic and social impact. After the arrival of the Spaniards, the demographic impact was catastrophic. It is estimated that the indigenous population suffered a drastic reduction, partly due to direct violence, but mainly because of European diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, for which the indigenous people had no immunity. This population decline resulted in significant social disruption, dismantling not only the labor force, but also the traditions and community organization that sustained Inca society. The destruction of Inca culture. The Spanish conquerors not only physically destroyed the empire, but also sought to eradicate Inca culture. Temples, fortresses, and palaces were looted or converted for Christian use. The Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun in Cusco, which was covered in gold leaf, was partially destroyed and replaced by a Catholic church. Inca books and records, which were mainly made using quipus, a system of knotted strings used for accounting and record-keeping, were ignored or destroyed, resulting in the loss of an immense amount of knowledge. Inca resistance. Despite the initial collapse, Inca resistance continued for several decades. The most notable example is the resistance led by Manco Inca, who, after being installed as a puppet ruler by the Spaniards, escaped and led a rebellion that culminated in the Siege of Cusco in 1536. Although he failed to recapture the city, Manco Inca established a resistance in Vilcabamba in the Peruvian jungle, which persisted until 1572, when the last Inca, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed. The integration and formation of a new society. Over time, the fusion between Inca and Spanish cultures gave rise to a new mixed-race society with its own identity. The Quechua language, for example, survived and is still widely spoken in Peru, becoming a symbol of cultural resistance. The Catholic religion, although widely adopted, incorporated elements of Inca spirituality, creating syncretic practices observed in Andean festivals and rituals to this day. Colonial economy. The colonial economy that emerged after the conquest was heavily based on the exploitation of natural resources, mainly silver and gold. The mines of Potosí, in present-day Bolivia, became one of the largest sources of silver in the world, fueling the global economy and enriching the Spanish crown. However, this wealth was obtained at the cost of enormous human sacrifices, with thousands of indigenous people forced to work in the mines under inhumane conditions. Long-term repercussions. The conquest of the Inca Empire marked the beginning of an era of colonization that had profound and lasting repercussions. The imposition of Spanish culture, religion, and language profoundly transformed the identity of Andean societies. At the same time, the resistance and adaptation of indigenous cultures created a complex heritage that continues to influence Peru and other countries in the region. Colonization also established the foundations for social stratification that still persists, where descendants of indigenous people often occupy lower social and economic positions. Contemporary movements seeking to recover and celebrate indigenous cultures are, in part, attempting to redress the impacts of centuries of marginalization that began with the conquest. Conclusion. The arrival of Pizarro and the subsequent conquest of the Inca Empire were events that forever changed the course of history in South America. While the brutality and devastation that accompanied this process are undeniable, the history is also marked by the resilience of the indigenous cultures that survived and that, to this day, continue to be a vital part of the cultural identity of Peru and the entire Andean region. Let's explore a few more areas to further enrich our understanding of the impact of the Spanish conquest on the Inca Empire. The conquistadors' influence on European politics. The conquest of the Inca Empire had repercussions not only in South America but also in Europe. The massive influx of gold and silver into Spain temporarily transformed it into the dominant power in Europe, funding wars and allowing the Spanish Empire to expand further. However, this influx also caused inflation and long-term economic problems, as the European economy could not absorb the massive quantity of precious metals without negative consequences. Chroniclers' accounts and the myth of El Dorado. The accounts of Spanish chroniclers about the wealth of the Incas and other South American peoples fueled myths such as El Dorado, a legendary city made entirely of gold. The search for El Dorado attracted numerous explorers over the centuries, all unsuccessful, but the legend helped perpetuate the vision of South America as a land of inexhaustible riches, justifying, in part, the continued exploration and colonization of the region. The creation of the encomiendas. After the conquest, the Spanish established the encomienda system, where colonizers were granted control over large areas of land and the indigenous people living on them. The encomenderos were responsible for protecting and Christianizing the indigenous people, but in practice, this resulted in a form of disguised slavery, where the indigenous people were forced to work under terrible conditions. This system was criticized by some voices within Spain itself, such as the Friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who became a defender of indigenous rights and a fierce critic of the abuses committed by the colonizers. The role of Inca myths and legends. Even after the conquest, many Inca myths and legends continued to influence society. One example is the myth of the return of a savior Inca who would rise again to lead his people against the oppressors. This idea resonated strongly in moments of resistance and indigenous revolts over the centuries. A famous example is the revolt of Tupac Amaru II in the 18th century, inspired by this tradition of resistance, which almost succeeded in liberating much of Peru from Spanish rule. The Bourbon reforms and the end of the viceroyalty of Peru. In the 18th century, the Bourbon reforms attempted to reorganize the Spanish colonies in America, including Peru. These reforms sought to increase administrative efficiency and maximize resource extraction. However, they also provoked discontent among both the Spanish settlers and the indigenous and mixed-race populations, leading to social tensions and revolts, such as the aforementioned Tupac Amaru II uprising. Independence and the Inca legacy. During the Latin American Wars of Independence in the early 19th century, the Inca legacy was revived as a symbol of resistance against Spanish colonialism. Leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín drew inspiration from Inca history to legitimize their struggles for independence, promoting the idea of a return to the indigenous roots of South American nations. However, after independence, the new Creole elites often continued to marginalize indigenous populations, perpetuating social and economic inequalities. The rediscovery of Machu Picchu and global interest. In 1911, American explorer Hiram Bingham rediscovered the Inca city of Machu Picchu, which had remained unknown to the outside world for centuries. This discovery sparked enormous global interest in Inca culture and Andean civilizations, putting Peru on the map as a major tourist and archaeological destination. Machu Picchu, in particular, became a symbol of Inca ingenuity and sophistication, challenging Eurocentric views that had underestimated the achievements of pre-Columbian civilizations. Cultural heritage and indigenous revitalization. In the 21st century, there is a growing effort to preserve and revitalize the cultural traditions, languages, and ancestral knowledge of the Incas and other Andean civilizations. Indigenous movements have been fighting for greater recognition and respect for their cultural and territorial rights. The revitalization of the Quechua language, the promotion of traditional agricultural practices, and the appreciation of ancestral medicinal knowledge are some examples of how indigenous legacies are being rescued and kept alive. Conclusion. The history of the conquest of the Inca Empire is a complex and multifaceted chapter that is not limited to destruction and domination. It is a story of resistance, adaptation, and cultural resilience. The impacts of this conquest are still felt today, both in the inequalities that persist and in the growing pride of indigenous populations for their traditions and history. The cultural blending that emerged from colonization continues to define the identity of the Andean countries, offering valuable lessons about the human capacity to survive and adapt in the face of adversity.